What we're going to do is invite Victoria to give the closing keynote now, and then she'll join us for the discussion on the last panel and regarding her talk. So we're switching those two around. It's my honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Victoria Follett, for the final keynote.
Thank you. Okay, I'll try. I have a real trouble with a leash, and I can project, so I'll try and stay by the mic, but I may wander. I'm going to talk a little bit, and I probably should have said, I'm going to talk about a therapy related to the work we've been talking about, and a little bit about conclusion, but leave the rest for our discussion. Thank you so much for being willing on that. First of all, I want to thank those of you who are willing to still be here at 4 on this beautiful day. I think it shows a lot of something. I don't know. Willingness, commitment, endurance, I don't know. So thank you for being willing. And also I want to, it's an amazing moment in the sense that it's coming full circle here from an experience that started at Garrison in 2009, I guess. It's so many years I can't remember now. But all of us together, and I think I have mixed thoughts about different aspects of my repertoire, but one of them is that I know a bunch of smart people with good ideas when I see them, and if any of you remember an old Andy Rooney play with Judy Garland, it's like they said, let's put on a play. I said, let's write a book about this. Come on, guys, we can do it. And actually, Laurie Perlman and I, and then Laurie disappeared. But yes, I thought, we got to write this down. It was amazing. So thank you for the universe putting me in that place. So I'll talk some about, I'm talking about therapy, obviously, and there are therapists and clients, but I don't have a lot of attachment to those selves because I think what's really important is that we're all fish in the same water. So I might, in any particular time, be in a role and be talking about one, but this is all of us. It's not us and them, but part of the human condition, in my view. I also I'll start at the front end. I've been doing this work for a long time. I've been lucky to work with Dr. Steve Hayes. But if it weren't for my graduate students, I wouldn't be here. They are an amazing source of inspiration, support, and just helping me to think really hard. And it's like sometimes the job is kind of hard at the university, but the graduate students are the best part by far. And so those of you students who are here, thank you. So we have this amazing image, this beautiful, and I have a crystal sort of globe that sits on my desk that looks a little bit like this, of how beautiful, how incredibly beautiful this world is from space. And there's 7 billion people, and when we come in contact with the ground level of what's happening on this earth, there's so much suffering in this beautiful planet spinning through space. Actually, I'm fortunate to be hooding a doctoral student in 2 weeks. Her family, her parents live in Nepal. They're alive, but they're homeless. And everything in her town was destroyed. So that's like 1 degree of separation for me, not some million miles away. And just 2 days ago, I was informed that a friend of mine's son died tragically related to drugs. And as you know, and as others have talked about, the unrest that's going on in parts of our country right now as a result of injustice. And so it's the dialectic of living in this incredible place and yet being able and willing to be in contact with the suffering. And so I'm speaking to people in this room who have that willingness to be in contact. And it does matter that I think John and other people's point about the powerfulness of being a person who's given the privilege of working in a situations with those who have survived great difficulties, that it's lucky we were chosen. I don't know how that happens. I'm not going to go there. But I do remember, in a funny connection with John, I was 17 years old when I went to nursing school, and I trained at LA County Hospital, and I worked.
Different guy. I didn't do this.
I know, you were too young, you weren't there. But we were both at LA County. I worked in the emergency room at LA County Hospital, which is not unlike the ER here at Mass General or that sort of ER, where came out of this little blue-collar community, and suddenly I saw a level of suffering and trauma that was unimaginable in any experience I'd ever had. And somehow I knew, and I don't know how, that was part of my path to work with those who were in the most pain. And although the world is full of suffering, it's also full of the overcoming of it. And I think this quote by Helen Keller so moved me in the sense of knowing her own life experience and how she made so much meaning out of a circumstance that many people would have felt helpless and given up. I also want to speak a bit, and this is kind of the discussion-y part, to the science notion. So I talk about dialectics and trauma, and some people feel like there's science and practice. But I was fortunate to have training where those two things are interwoven and always are one part of another, that it's a bidirectional relationship, and that either side of the house, as we sometimes talk at the university, that those in the ivory tower feel like, well, maybe clinicians don't know, or clinicians feel that we can't be in touch with what it's really like. In the best case, and in doing this work, those two just go together and richly inform each other. In fact, some of the most interesting to me studies were ones that came directly out of clinical supervision with my graduate students. And we'd say, well, everybody kind of knows this, don't they? And then we'd look at the literature, and everybody kind of knew it, but nobody actually checked. And so I want to give a shout out for the importance of whatever context and being willing to evaluate how it's working. We do have evidence-based practice, and there is so much room for growth in that. So, you can read about the most established treatments that are rolled out in the VA, and they have data under them, and they do. And you still look. There's a vast number of people who are not willing to be engaged in that kind of therapy, or who might have a more diverse range of problems that don't fit that, or that they drop out, or we still have so much to learn about the treatment and care of humans. I saw an amazing TED Talk the other day where a man was talking about depression, and the state of the literature as well as his own experience. And he said, I hope 50 years from now it'll be like medicine, where we'll be able to look back and say, our tools were so clumsy. So I think, yes, we have things that we're using, and I love them, and especially you students that carry this forward, there's way more that we need to know to help others. And there are many people who have had a range of kinds of therapy, but still have room to grow or feel that they haven't benefited for some of those existing methods. So it's fascinating to me. I just like saying zeitgeist, so I put it up there. Zeitgeist. This is like, so I put it into most of my lectures. My undergraduates think, what's up with her? But it is interesting to me how we've come to this place as a culture and as a group of therapists. And so I think that if you read about, some people have talked about waves of behavior therapy or waves of empirical support, and I think it parallels what's gone on in the culture, that we've gotten better and better tools, right? And look at us. I mean, there are people I know in this room who are suffering with something bad probably right now, because statistically that would be almost impossible that there weren't. And we're sitting in a room, we have safe seats, we have more food than, I actually was worried about lunch. I thought, I hope they're going to take that food somewhere because of the amount we throw out in this country. No commentary on lunch, it's just, that but the point being that we have so much at the time when other people are sitting without food, without shelter. I mean, we're trying to get tents into Nepal. We don't need to worry at this moment about how people are going to feel. Right now, we have to establish basic safety so that people can begin the process of healing. So here we are, and I think John made an interesting comment. We've got so much, and he talked about the movie stars in Hollywood who, what, the money, everything they could want, right? And we as a culture, and I believe some of us as therapists, we have hit the wall because we have it all, and we are still lost and struggling. Jim talked about this in his talk. Are we moving towards having more brilliant thoughts, or are we moving towards having more BMWs or whatever? But in some ways in Western culture, I think mindfulness, this is why it's on Time magazine in my view, and emerging in other places, and it's a parallel process for us as therapists, that we realized that having all this stuff or reducing or getting rid of symptoms does not equal having the rich and rewarding and vital life that is the direction of human nature, in my view. So being in contact with the present moment awakens the pain of what is not also there. And that's for us in Western culture. And that might be why it's so acutely felt when you don't have to worry where you're going to sleep tonight. I don't think any of us have to worry about that. And yet, you go home to the abyss. Some people will go home to an abyss tonight, probably, of just loss. Even hearing all these talks, which have been amazing, stirs up pain of your own history and or history of individuals you've worked with. In fact, exposure to trauma and pain is part of everyone's life experience. We heard some statistics on that, and we can do that. But part of the human condition, again, the parallel between Eastern traditions and what we're learning from science, is that exposure to really painful, bad experiences is just part of typical life experience, and that the pain associated with that is universal. The difficulty is that we've tried really hard to find other ways out. But the way out is through. And in fact, when I first heard this, I was actually in the room with John. You think we hang out a lot, but he's way down in LA. But we were at a conference in DC, and Judith Herman held up a picture, a drawing by one of her clients, and it was something like a board game, the healing game. And the trick was there were all these paths, but the way out was through. That was the first time I heard that. That was in 1989 or 90, and I have never forgotten the impact of this client saying she realized she had to go through. We talk about, in the work I do, this again was developed by Steve Hayes, this notion, and sorry for the shading, this notion of experiential avoidance as being part of the problem of dealing with pain. And it's a phenomena that covers a broad range of behaviors that, but the important part of the behavior is they function to alter private experience. So this is why, actually I don't treat as many people. I'm not in love with the DSM. I'm sorry, it's on tape, I said it. Because I'm more interested about caring for the individual in the room and what they bring to me. And I recognize that having syndrome sometimes helps us to understand and plan ahead, but it has side effects associated with it. But you see, correlationally, there were 100 studies, maybe more, when I first started doing this, that say trauma is associated with this, it's associated with this. It's like all these different things. And it's like, well, why would it have so many outcomes besides PTSD? Because those different behaviors, that stopping eating, that running beyond what is a healthy amount, the drinking, the cutting, the spacing out, all those variables function to alter private experience. They function to help you distance from your pain and suffering and from your own authentic self. So suffering, in our view, is associated with trying to get rid of the experience associated with trauma or any life experience. So experiential avoidance has been used not just in trauma, but in other areas. I won't go into it because it's 4 o'clock and why would you want to know, but there's a huge amount of data now that demonstrates the relationship of this construct to a range of psychological issues and also as a mediating factor in therapy change. But you don't have to see the structural equation model. The other thing that was brought up, so I'm going to talk a little bit about treatment, but I think it's important to remember, do trauma survivors always need treatment? And this was a mistake that we made early on. It's a natural mistake. I understand how we did it. You would assume somebody going through something really painful you would offer treatment to help deal with it. But in fact, if you're not as familiar with that literature, please, seminal work is Bonanno, who happened to be doing longitudinal research in New York at the time of the World Trade Center. And he has an amazing article where he actually has data to track all the different types of trajectories after a traumatic experience. And there were people who fairly quickly returned to baseline. There were others who did have spikes, but then gradually returned. There was more delayed condition, and then finally there are people who get exposed and maintain high levels of trauma symptoms. But one of the important lessons we learned as researchers was sometimes early intervention could interfere with normative healing. However, we end up seeing the people who come to our office who have been, in many cases, in other kinds of therapy and have had long-term kinds of problems, life problems associated with a history of trauma that are not the typical 4+ PTSD. So it's acceptance and change therapy, and as has already been alluded to, the notion of the dialectic of, well, if I accept, why would I change, is sometimes brought up. However, those two can coexist, and this is both a new and an old concept because, of course, Eastern traditions tell us all the time about coexistence. I want to say, because one of the things that I've written a fair amount about ACT and trauma, but if you know a little bit about it, you don't always hear the ACT piece where I talk a lot about the skills and safety piece as a beginning point in treatment. So my primary task with the client is to identify what are their strengths, what are their vulnerabilities, what point, and people have referenced this all, this is kind of interesting in terms of, I've heard my talk all throughout the day. It's just different language and people have touched on different points. But you begin where the client is. And if they come from, I work a lot with abuse survivors from childhood who did not come from foundational settings where they would have learned basic skills like self-soothing. I mean, that's a learning process that happens from the time you're born. And in certain environments, nobody supports you. I love the picture of the chimp and the baby. And, but not everybody has that process for a variety of reasons, and it's not just in trauma families. And so those people may be vulnerable to doing dangerous things, like going out and driving in a blackout or taking an overdose when overexposed to traumatic material. I've seen clients take drugs before session when they knew they were going to talk about their trauma, where they were impaired in a risky way. So I want to know that there's a foundational set of skills, and frankly, I just am not a reinvent the wheel kind of person. I've drawn a lot of my skills work from Marsha Linehan's DBT because I think she wrote such a great explanation that's non-pathologizing of how to teach foundational safety skills so that one is ready to begin to develop and do the trauma work. So I'm just going to give you ACT in a nutshell. Some people say it's nutty, but you know, the basic notion is this notion of accept. Accept what? Is it okay that trauma happens? Do you put up with it? Do you tolerate it? Do you just sit with discomfort? As somebody said to me the other day, just because someone gave you a cactus, are you going to sit on it? It is, you accept, I think they were actually talking to me, Victoria the person, because I was like, yeah. Accepting our history is additive, that we can't subtract. Accepting things as they are, not because they were okay, it's not about forgiveness, that's an important client decision. But your history has happened, and there is nothing in this world that I know of that makes history subtractive. You cannot pull that away. So accepting your history and who you are now as we move forward choosing. This is a vital therapy where there's a tremendous amount of work, and it is a non-hierarchical therapy, is a non-patriarchal therapy in the sense that many of the people I work with, and I've worked with veterans too, male veterans, not just child abuse survivors, and people come from very authoritative backgrounds where somebody tells them what to do. And we had, in our past, history of therapeutic involvement that was about, do this, get better. And what I hear a lot here is, join with me, let's look at this path, and here are ways forward. But it's supporting the client in making choices, and choices about their life values. And coming from certain kinds of histories, you never were asked what your value was. You were told what to do. In the most simple case, I had a client, just sort of random conversation, was going to buy pie on the way home, and I like pie. I said, what kind of pie are you getting? And she says, oh, my husband likes apple, and my child likes lemon. And I said, well, what do you like? And in that moment, we came smack in contact with a 45-year-old woman who said, I never think about what kind of pie I like. It's what other people like. And it was a perfect moment of coming into contact with what our struggle had been in therapy. She'd never had a place to think about her own values and her own forward direction. And taking action. So there's some overlap here with the behavioral activation, the work we see in MBCT. So finding your direction, going west, a value, and having that value, taking the steps, beginning the process, and that process can be really small. But it's, for example, one of my values is to be a person who learns and a person who's educated. It just came out somehow, and I am not there. I am sitting here giving this talk, which I think is frickin' weird, by the way, because I come from this little town in Covina, and, you know, I was supposed to get married when I was 18 because that would be the right thing to do. And it wasn't, they weren't oppressive people, that was just what they thought the right thing to do, and I'm standing here. But, we're glad you are. Thank you. But I was learning every minute here. I know a lot of what some of you talked about, but I don't know all the details. Learning is never going to stop for me. It certainly didn't stop the day I got my PhD, or I would have been kind of in trouble because I didn't know all that much then. But, you know, so taking action in valued direction. So it's not like just accomplishing a goal. It's moving past that. And we talk about that this can happen in the presence of psychological flexibility. Psychological flexibility is this ability to be in the present moment without defense, as it is, as a conscious human being, based on, and being able to behave based on what the situation affords. So moving forward in ways that are consistent with your values. This is a really complicated thing that we love to show and act, and I'm not going to spend any time on it because I'm out of time. However, these are the 6 processes. I'll do what John did. I'm not going to talk about it, but now I'm going to talk about it. 6 processes. But I want to just show you, by the way, he did a small act of kindness 1,000,000 years ago that actually probably changed the course of my career. So never doubt that you can make a difference.
Oh, come on now. I know.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that drug?
No, you don't know? It was, people asked me to explain, what do you think about I said, how the universe works is so beyond what I could ever comprehend that I don't want to tell you a story about that. I could make up a story. But I was just out of graduate school, and we shared a cab ride, and I told him an idea, and he said, "Why don't you write a chapter? I have a book about that." And that was the very first thing I wrote by myself, and that had to do with trauma, and it just opened a door for me, in a psychological door. So basically, universe, cab, John, here I am. But in this hexaflex, we talk about this psychological flexibility in this space, and you can see where it overlaps with Eastern traditions in the place of acceptance and contact with the present moment. Self as context, rather observer self, and then we can argue about transcendent versus, where does that self go? But certainly not self as content, that is professor, teacher, talker, whatever. Diffusing from language. Language is not literal truth. All of these things have connections, as David talked about in certain ways, to how we understand Eastern traditions. And then again, our values is a huge piece of this, and I was going to focus on that, but now I will move past, because I've already told you that it's moving forward in a direction that is going to make a difference. And I hope all of you are doing that, not only in your therapy work, but in how you're thinking about your work beyond therapy. So in closing, there are many avenues we've heard today, and ways and languages of talking about doing the work, but there's a lot of shared vision in here. There's different parts of overlap in the Venn diagrams. But we're finding common ground, and I would argue that our task in moving forward is to do the work, to address the suffering in the world, to evaluate our work in whatever way. That can be just checking in with a SUDS rating on your clients on a regular basis when you're in private practice, or it can be doing some big ginormous study. And spreading the word. We still need to spread the word and disseminate the work. And this is my thank you to you, and how I think of our work and the work of the warrior, which is our clients, ourselves. This is a well-known anthropologist who studied indigenous peoples and found similar principles showing up. And the basic principle is that the way of the warrior in indigenous peoples is showing up, choosing to be present, honor and respect for all things, employing judicious communication, setting limits and boundaries, being responsible, and I would say response-able as well, to change, disciplined, right use of power, understanding the power of presence, to bring forward energetically all four experiences, the mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical that is in us all. And this is the love of my life. And it's a reminder to me, because the work is hard, and it is reinforcing in the sense of being able to make a difference. And you need to be in contact with other pieces of joy in your life in order to sustain the energy to move forward, in my view. And there's all kinds of love and connection, but I've never, if her current face could be Skyped in, she's 27 now, she'd be making a face at me and say, "Why are you bringing me into this talk?" But this moment of joy is so perfect. I can never capture these things on camera, but I wanted to say, find that love in your life that thing that matters. It could be the earth, it could be changing science. Find that path that sustains you in the work. Thank you. Probably should click her off.
Alrighty, well, we're going to move into a discussion of our panelists, and thank you so much for that wonderful conclusion. So, to begin, my dear friend Susan Pollack is going to come and give her discussion. Susan is the founding president of the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy. She's also a clinician and an instructor at Harvard, and is in her alma mater. She's a former student of the Harvard Divinity School, and so please welcome Susan as she gives her response.
So my remarks are really concise because I want to make sure you have a chance to talk. So I have about 4 minutes, and I was thinking, how in the world am I going to do anything useful in 4 to 5 minutes? And I was inspired by dear friend and colleague and meditation teacher who's here, Willa Miller, who was taught a practice where you just sort of distill the experience, asking, what is the gift? So that's what I've done with each chapter and the talks. So from David and Deborah's paper and David's presentation, and this also, thank you, Jared, ties into Jared's phrase, that karma can become dharma. And I want to even extend that in the spirit of your talk, feeling that trauma can become dharma. And that is in the presence of a healing relationship. And again, bow to John, I totally agree, everything is based on a good, trusting alliance. That without that, mindfulness can just be a technique. So there can be profound transformation even though there has been horrific trauma. And the take-home is we don't have to live there forever. And I think in many ways, David, your radical talk really taught us there that we don't, in trauma, we tend to recycle and go over and over, ruminating. And I think one of the wonderful things about this tradition is there is the sense that it can be a spiral, thanks, Chris, and not only a spiral, but there can be liberation. We are not trapped in a hell realm forever. So Pat Ogden's paper and Barbara's presentation echo what Jim said last night when he talked about the embodiment circuitry. So healing can deepen and suffering can transform when there's greater awareness and acceptance of bodily experience. Sensory motor psychotherapy, and I've been trained in that as well as IFS and EMDR, puts into practice what David Emerson taught us yesterday when he spoke of describing his approach to yoga. And full disclosure, David's been one of my yoga teachers, and he's a wonderful teacher, and he really practices that, which is just as the teacher in yoga embodies movement and curiosity, everything is an option. The patient learns to be in touch with her own body. The embodiment then becomes the context of safe relationships. And then just going back to something lovely that Barbara said, to be human means to become visible. And I think in the practice of embodied movement and yoga, we become visible to ourselves. In Dick Schwartz and Flint Sparks' paper, and with the addition of Frank's presentation, goes back to central teaching in Tibetan and Mahayana Buddhist traditions, which I learned in this very room. that all mind states are valuable energies that can be transformed into wholesome qualities. And this links in such a beautiful way with Tony's talk that in the patterns of PTSD, with mindfulness, with therapy, that the scans can look like the scans of healthy people after the introduction of mindfulness. So again, what a message that all states are valuable, all parts are welcome, and everything can be transformed. And just to wrap up, we've been talking a lot about Judy Herman. A number of us in this room have trained with her since late 70s, early 80s, forever. I think of Judy as being sort of the grandmother of trauma treatment. And she has a phrase that I share with many of my trauma survivors, which is going from victim to survivor to thriver. Let me say that again. Victim to survivor to thriver. And I can't help but notice that in some ways it parallels what Chris said earlier this morning, that we're going from kaboom to kabloom. So that is a really quick, pithy encapsulation of the conference. And I just want to say, maybe this is to open up conversation, questions. David, I kept on thinking about your talk, and where it took me as a student of Buddhism was to the notion of, well, first I want to say I think it's a radical thinking about trauma. And it made me go back to the death practices. And for those who aren't familiar with the tradition, the monks are taught to go into the charnel grounds, which are the cemeteries, and really meditate on the dissolution of the body, the decomposition of the body, how nothing lasts. So I think what you're doing in the deepest reframing is that trauma is an encounter with death, but with the idea of other lives, that's not all there is. So, thank you.
Thank you, Susan, for that wonderful conclusion. We're going to open it up for some questions. We have some limited time, but we can take a number of questions. So I'm going to pass these out to. I think they're both on. First of all, I was just ask if any of our panelists have questions for each other, and if not, we can go outward. All right. We'll just sit. We've got one over there.
I work with children now. The youngest in my current caseload is 6. The oldest is 15. HCT is what it's called in Maine. It's the CBHI model of in-home intensive therapy. So I have 6 months on average, about 3 hours a week. Do you have any comments about the introduction of any approach to introception, the capacity to be self-aware as an exchange with the rigid adaptive behaviors that these little guys have in response to their traumatized lives?
I think on this panel, I'm the only one who works with children, so I'll do my best to respond from my experience. I've worked with children as young as 2.5, and with trauma material that is the most horrific. Primary area of focus is around children who were adopted from other parts of the world, who suffered at the hands of the people who abandoned them or who took care of them before they were adopted and brought to this country. In addition, medical trauma is another kind of source of trauma, and the ill effects are profound. I've also worked in kind of more global trauma-related environments, like in earthquake zones. I did some relief work in Turkey with helpers, educators who were working with children who lost their families, for instance. So I speak from that kind of history. The dysregulation, the breach of attachment, the lack of any confidence or trust that the care of a kind other can be, in fact, relied upon is not a given. So the first task is, from a Buddhist perspective, about the Mahayana message, which is, acknowledging the suffering, acknowledging the distrust, and naming it as such with a deep yearning and a very quiet invitation to try to connect, to try and accept the gift of kindness. Sometimes with foster parents, sometimes with adoptive parents, and sometimes in conjunction in the psychotherapy context where the parent and the child is meeting with me together. We find moments of joy, moments of connection that speak to the fundamental need to trust and to feel loved, or even more basically belonged to. The role of mindfulness, the capacity to feel embodied in the moment as a little one, when there's sufficient safety in the relationship, is profound and wonderful to see. It's often in the form of play, gross motor play, symbolic play, parallel play, giggling, tickling, peekaboo, those kinds of very simple ways that we as human beings connect become the vehicle for an initial sense of embodiment. From there then, with that kind of safety and stability in embodied experience, only then can the children that I see can even begin to name the bad things that happen to them, whether it's regarding being the victim of a pedophile or a worker in the hospital who sexually abused instead of helped with condition when they had no helper helping them other than the perpetrator in the hospital setting, or whatever the problem was. Only after the sense of, in the present moment, feeling the kindness and trusting that kindness, does the child be able to then claim embodiment without fear.
Is it okay if I to take this off? Okay. So one thing that Deborah might not even know is that I worked in a school for the deaf for 18 years as a school counselor. And one of the ways that we worked on making an internal experience visible was using, if you don't mind holding this for me while I'm speaking to it, using a drum. So for example, we might say like, so what happens when you go home? And the kid might,
I'm sorry.
it's okay, might go. And the way of, it's not because the kids were deaf, because deaf kids can communicate, like, if they have had exposure to sign language. Some kids didn't have language. It's a way of making an experience visible, and then one can mirror, just as one would in narrative, by imitating the same intensity of what they're doing. So it's a way of expressing emotion. And they love it. It's fun. It's play. Play's real.
Any other questions?
I was just going to add to what Barbara said. There's a wonderful old film of dance movement therapy by a woman named Janet Adler, who, and it was one of her original sort of pieces of work, very much representing what you were saying, Barbara, working with an autistic child, so working older, a bit older, but maybe 7 or 8, but who had no language. And so what she simply did as a dance movement therapist is that she entered the child's space and mirrored the child's movements, which of course at first were very contorted and very distanced and very disconnecting. And eventually the child ended up sitting over time in her lap. I mean, that's a long process, but just the way you're sort of describing it. So to be able to use a completely nonverbal sensory motor approach, you know.
This is just a quick comment. As being in education before social work, I had an aha moment that I hope everyone appreciates. It's a little weird about sharing a comment. But I realized that as a social worker, we're asking kids to be verbal and exhibit information processing, right? Like that's what's happening when we ask them a question and we want a response. And yet all the research, especially the recent research, has showed that developmentally, they don't necessarily have those capacities. So it was a moment, as you said, Victoria, of putting science and practice together and being like, here we are having all this knowledge of developmental trajectories and making logistical state, logic, informing logic into statements and whatnot. And then we're asking them to give us these verbal responses, well, not us, thankfully. So thank you to those of you who are learning to ask the children to communicate in a different way, because they have their stories to share, just maybe not in the limited way that some therapists ask them to.
I also want to respond to that a little bit from the kid perspective. The clip that I showed, it's not coincidental that I showed that clip, actually, that we're in communication and collaboration with Pixar, actually. And this whole idea, from my perspective, is going to have a profound impact on the way people see emotions and the little voices inside of our heads. So when I talk to the producers, and by the way, kids get into parts really easily. They're like, duh, of course I do. This is obvious to kids, so it's not a big leap to get them to think about themselves in these different capacities. But, this is going to normalize this idea of emotions are okay. You can be really mad, you can be really sad, you can be really angry, and it's okay. And they're bringing it out to the world in a way that's going to be profound from my experience. This is normalizing mental health. This is normalizing emotions. So I'm really hopeful and excited to collaborate with them around what this movie can potentially do to the masses. So I think it's a huge opportunity for us to help bring this change about really early on. So,
Can you tell us a bit about that? That was fascinating. And is it that a movie yet?
So Jonas Rivera is a producer, Peter Docter is the director, and Peter Docter developed this when his preteen daughter was becoming 12 years old, and him and his wife was like, what is going on inside of her head? Like, she just started this attitude change, she started getting really nasty, and then they did this whole concept from the movie of Up for the last 6 years on developing this whole idea of emotions. They did work with some researchers around emotional networks, but other than that, they had no idea what they were getting into, really. It's really sweet to talk to them because they're these kind of young, hip, creative types. And I said, it was great for me to hear that you guys did a movie on IFS. And, of course, they're laughing and all this stuff. They're like, you mean, really, this is going to have an impact beyond an entertainment value? They were thrilled. They wanted to make an impact, and they just thought it was a cool, fun idea. They didn't want to make it very scientific, but it was this whole idea of these moments with kids, what's going on in their head, and then they were thrilled to hear that this is, in the mental health field, that we're working on this. There's this huge movement from cognitive to affectively based therapies. The movie's coming out June 19th. We're actually having a pre-screening here in Boston with the foundation and with IFS with that. And then we're hoping to collaborate with them after the release to bring some of this through animated film into school systems. So this is my hope, is that we're going to be able to utilize them and their excitement about this, and they're wanting to make an impact to really make change in that way. So we'll see what happens.
So it doesn't have to be seen as an IFS film, though, right?
Not at all. They're like IFS. They didn't even hear of IFS. They didn't even know what the heck that was. Absolutely. You could do whatever you want when you're watching it. Turn it in. Yeah, but it's ideas of emotions. Beautiful. Inside Out is the name of the movie, and it's coming out June 19th.
So we probably have time for one more question, and then we'll have to transition. So I don't know if there's anybody else that has other questions.
I guess I have a question. So this, I guess, is for David and Deborah, or any of you who consider to be inspired by Buddhist practices. My question is about I guess, appropriation in the process of appropriating Buddhist practices for therapeutic models. And I could hear some of it in some of the comments you're making about, so I see that you're self-conscious about it in some ways, so I'm curious how you've been thinking through it. My concern is twofold. One is abstracting Buddhism as method and philosophy, but not so much as culture and as the sort of practices of living people. And the second fold concern is the actual history of trauma within Buddhist traditions, including sexual trauma too, that a lot of people have experienced both in American communities and abroad too. There's not a lot of good data on it, but I know from anecdotal evidence. So I'd be really curious to hear how you guys think through using these methods, but also at the same time remaining sensitive to the cultural history and the history of trauma within the traditions themselves. Because I'm not neglecting the importance of the project, but it's complicated. So I'm curious what you have to say.
Can I take that? I'm going to pick up on one thing you said, the appropriation. I've thought about that quite a bit, and the answer to it is another teaching in the Tibetan tradition called precious human life. How many people are familiar with that teaching? What it says basically is, and again here, now we're in the Buddhist frame, we're not in the psychological frame, but in the Buddhist frame it says, here you are in a human lifetime where you have enough freedom from suffering to start thinking about enlightenment. If you're in a lower realm, a hell realm, an animal realm, a ghost realm, you suffer so much that you can't do it. It's just out of the question. If you're in a higher realm, actually, interestingly enough, you can't do it either because you're so besotted with pleasure, and so you don't even think about it. You think everything's fine until at some point it crashes. So translating that to the psychological realm now, people who are suffering cannot think about meditating. They can't meditate. They can't think about enlightenment. We need to relieve suffering. And you look at the Dalai Lama, he doesn't go around saying, well, I'm not going to relieve people's ordinary suffering because the real relief is enlightenment, and that's what we're going to drive them all toward. No, he's absolutely focused on relieving everyday suffering with that long view. So he's integrating both perspectives, and of course most of us here have to worry about the lower perspective, so there's enormous necessity, if not value, and value in just relieving everyday suffering. It's what we have to do.
Can I actually add something to that as well? As you were mentioning your comment, I was thinking that in part one of the challenges is that psychology as a discipline has not been the most, although it's a very reflective practice, not the most reflective in terms of its own social and historical development.
Like torture and stuff?
Yeah, things like torture being one of our major issues and more recently. I highly recommend the work of Philip Cushman, his book, Constructing the Self, Constructing America. He does a cultural history of psychology. But I think in many ways, this sort of integration of Buddhist traditions and psychologies represents an opportunity for psychologists to reflect on the religious traditions in which its own tradition is already abstracted. In addition to Judeo-Christian traditions, there's a host of traditions that are reflected within a variety of psychological theories. And psychologists are not frequently the most intellectually honest about where those sources of tradition thread to. So I think it's a really important question. I get concerned when I see Time magazine, which is, in a sense, raising the issue of the way that religion has been colonized through sort of a capitalist lens. I think we have to be really vigilant. So I just really appreciate your comment, and thank you for raising that.
I want to thank all of you, first of all, for being a part of this path in the healing of suffering in all of its forms.